Well, it's day 3 of the Pope's Africa tour, and yes, the Pope is still in Nairobi, Kenya. So far, the Pope has visited major sites in Nairobi, including the popular Slum. In the Pope's latest message to the youth of Kenya, he urged them not to succumb to the sweet lure of corruption. Scrapping a pre-prepared script, the Pope addressed a packed Nairobi stadium with a down-to-earth and spontaneous style that has endeared him to Catholics and others around the world. Now, Pope Francis also urged Kenyans to unite and take a stand against the destructive effect of tribalism. Kenya was shaken by inter-ethnic violence after elections in 2007, in which 1,200 people died. Well, let's get the latest on the Pope's visit. Now that he's still in Kenya, I'm now being joined by Lenny Ruvaga, VOS correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa. Well, it's the Pope's third day in Nairobi. Lots of memories to be cherished by both Kenyans and the Pope. What's the latest?
Thank you so much for having me. Good news. The Pope actually left about an hour ago. He had a very tight schedule. Earlier today in the morning at around 8 a.m. Nairobi, East African time, he visited Kangemi, an informal settlement on the outskirts of Nairobi capital of about 100,000 residents, where he addressed injustices meted out on the local population and altruism that comes from the government. So he wasn't shy to speak about injustices that come about with poverty levels, low housing facilities, or a lack of infrastructure in this informal settlement in Nairobi and indeed around the country and in Africa as a whole.
That's right. The Pope's message on corruption for many was long awaited. Any reactions from the Kenyan politicians?
Well, there were no immediate reactions per se after he spoke, because what happened was when he was speaking, the youth were reacting. It's as if he read their minds and he could read into the psyche of all the Kenyans, not just the youth, but all Kenyans of all cadres of ages, irrespective of being young or old. He talked about corruption being sweet as sugar. At first, it's tasty, but the more you take it, it kills you and eventually robs the nation of its due profit, of its due income, and thereon. So basically, he was reading the psyche of the Kenyan youth, and this resonated well with everybody. No immediate reactions from politicians, but this was a rousing applause from all in attendance.
That's right. No, so the Pope's visit to the slum at the very heart of Nairobi obviously got him talking about the widened gap of inequality. Do you see the Kenyan government addressing the issues?
The Kenyan government is caught between a rock and a hard place. As you're aware of, in the last 2 weeks, the Kenyan government has been faced with corruption scandals, and we've had very many foreign dignitaries standing up against corruption and issuing letters of protest against the Kenyan government on the skyrocketing corruption that's going unchecked. So I can't say it's caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, there's an election coming up in a year. On the other hand, it has to satisfy the international community by showing that it's indeed acting on rampant corruption that is robbing them of development projects and so forth.
That's right. So, I mean, the Pope spent about 50% of his time in Kenya. He's due to go back to Europe on the 29th. What does this mean for the whole of Kenya?
Well, for the whole of Kenya, I think all Catholics around the country were pleased that indeed he made this his first stop on his tour in Africa before going on to Uganda and eventually to CAR, an active war zone. But they were quite pleased that indeed he graced them with their presence. We've had Kenyans from all walks of life around the country traversing from the northern, the southern, and the east and the west towards the capital just to converge and have mass with Papa, as they fondly call him. So it is more of giving back to the Catholic Church and having communion with the faithful and reigniting the embers of your faith to the Catholic faithful. And it's such a pregnant statement to all Kenyans, and I think they're quite pleased that this will go to the annals of history.
Right. So, everyone sees the Pope visit to anywhere in the world as such a blessing. What significant impact do you see this Pope's visit having on Kenya?
Well, the Kenyan youth, I was glad to be part of them this morning. We're very happy that the Pope came and spoke their language in the fact that he read their minds. He talked about corruption. He talked about radicalization. And of importance, he said that most of the youth are turning to radicalization because A, there is no work, and B, they're not properly educated. And this really, really strung on the drumbits of their heart. And I can't say that they were quite pleased that someone spoke their language without any hidden agenda. So I could say they were quite pleased with this.
Right. Thank you so much, Lenny Ruvaga, for us in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for speaking to us on Network Africa.